Hans, we've both done a fair bit of work looking into the funding that's been going on in terms of the NGOs that have been responsible for driving the illegal immigration up into our country and really throughout our country. And always suspected that the funding probably went far beyond just the State Department and USAID, which, just for so everybody's clear, they are the big gorillas in the room. That's where the enormous amount of funding is coming from. But, we started hearing about FEMA funding, so we thought we'd take a look. And as soon as we did, we almost fell out of our chair. I mean, the grants just spill forth. And they're all to the same names, the same charities, I shouldn't say charities, the same NGOs that are being funded by the State Department and by USAID. So FEMA is providing hundreds of millions of dollars to groups like primarily Catholic charities and all their various sub-entities, which again are all the NGOs that are actually primarily responsible for driving the immigration into our country.
No, that's right. And again, we have the same pattern that we've had so many times, that people pick up on this. People go, whoa, what's going on here? Why is all this money being spent by FEMA? And of course, the reason why the focus suddenly was on FEMA was the hurricane, the earlier one, Helene. And then people were like, well, FEMA ran out of money because all that money went to the migrants. And then the media, and this is the pattern I'm talking about, the media had this big outcry, as they always do. And we're like, no, that's disinformation, misinformation, whatever. And then, as you just said, you and I just went on their own website and just had a look. And it's right there. And the numbers are, they don't lie because, well, they come from FEMA itself, but also they've been going up, and they've been going up hugely during the course of the Biden presidency. So these are incontrovertible facts. Now, we can argue about whether FEMA, which of course is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is not supposed to be doing these things, at least not in the sense that this is an entirely self-inflicted emergency, if it even is an emergency. Can you call something an emergency that you planned for? That's something else here, isn't it? But that's not what the agency was created for. And if you want to suddenly say it is, okay, that might be a policy change or something, but then you have to discuss that. There has to be some kind of debate. There has to be some discourse about that. But instead, what the media said was like, no, it's not happening. Well, it is happening. You can go and justify it, but it is happening.
Yeah, and it's easy to find. If people want to go look for this, just go to the FEMA website, go to grants, and then drop down, and you have to look in two areas. And the first area, the biggest one, is the shelter and services. And that's where, if you go in there and look and drop down to the bottom, towards the bottom of that page, you'll very quickly see the numbers. And it was $650 million in 2024, and it was $364 million in 2023. But, the story doesn't end there. There's also something called the Emergencies Food and Shelter Program. And that's another, once again, go into grants and then find that, emergency food and shelter. And that one's a little bit more confusing because there's a table down at the bottom of that, and it lists various amounts. And the amounts are big. 2023, 425 million. Now, that's the last date because FEMA graces us by telling us that the last time they updated that was June of 2023. So we actually don't have any further figures. So we don't even know anything for 2024. But then when you follow that link in, suddenly you're looking at all the entities that are being paid by FEMA and by the State Department and by USAID. And it's the Red Cross, it's the Catholic Charities, which is really the big guy in the room. You'll see the various entities, although from there you'll need a password to go any further. But, this is all just a coordinated thing. It's coming from, people don't realize what kind of discretionary budgets. You talked about the fact that this funding, it should be discussed if they're going to change kind of their mode of operation, like what they're going to do. And yet so many people don't even realize that our own State Department has the ability to take billions of dollars out of discretionary funding and send it wherever they want, which in this case has been to the UN and to the UN-related NGOs, which we're talking about specifically. Again, Catholic Charities is the one that comes up time and time and time again. If people go further and break and actually go into the grants themselves, you'll see what I'm talking about. Catholic charities will be repeated over and over and over again.
Yeah, when you let's just look at two numbers here. This is for the humanitarian money that's given to organizations. Now we'll come back to that here in a moment, because this whole idea that the government uses taxpayer money to subcontract to other people is sort of very problematic in itself. Because, as you know, where the money goes to and what the motivations are and so on. So when there's no longer a direct line between the government and then the money gets spent by the government on some immediate measure, action, whatever. So this is destroyed, because what they do instead, and these are the money flows I'm going to talk about here in a moment. They take the money, taxpayer money, and they give it to someone else to then do something with that money. So this is a big problem in and of itself. But before we get into that, I mean, let's just look at the numbers, right? So for this humanitarian assistance money that goes to these other organizations to help migrants, supposedly, under Trump, the last number was 30 million.
Right, 2019.
So just a chunk of it. A few years later, 2023, under Biden, that was 425 million. So we're talking about like a factor of something like 15. So 15 times more money is spent under Biden, under this category, than under Trump. So again, this is incontrovertible. And as you said, this is not even the latest number, because they don't give it to us. So we don't know. I assume it's like just gone through the roof from there. And on all these other categories. But we're just looking at this one category here. You can argue that it's necessary for this or that reason or whatever, but you cannot argue about the fact that the amount spent has gone up 15-fold. Now, of course, we could say, well, why was FEMA under Trump spending any money on this? Because, isn't the point of FEMA to be looking after emergencies and natural disasters, that kind of stuff? Well, that's another argument, but I guess, 30 million in terms of the federal budget is just a drop in the ocean. But here we're talking about massive increases. And, as you already laid out, massive increases across the board. This is just one category I picked out. And again, the reason why I picked it out is because I have a huge conceptual problem with the government just handing money to some organization to do something. Now, of course, the government will sometimes have to subcontract things. Like the government isn't going to build its own airplanes, so they will subcontract to Boeing or whoever. But this is for a very specific thing. There's a contract involved. You need to build me so and so many airplanes and so many this or whatever. But here we're talking about something much more diffuse, something much more sort of fuzzy. It's like, well, help migrants. Well, what does that even mean? And here, have a bunch of hundreds of millions of dollars. Huge problem, not only specifically in terms of the money and all that, but just even generally, just as a concept, this idea that the government just hands money to some organization and then whatever.
I also think, there's another important point, I think, a distinction that needs to be made. You mentioned the 30 million. Well, the 30 million was in 2019. There was actually no money that was spent in 2020. And then in 2021, during the first year of the Biden regime, it's basically a four-bagger. It goes up to 110 million, so almost four times the amount. But I think the important element that people should understand is that 30 million was probably being used as it was originally envisioned. In other words, for humanitarian purposes, for people that maybe were at the border. That is very different from using that same money to not only get them to the border, but also to then spread them throughout the rest of the U.S. So I'm all but positive that we're going to see that there was a massive structural change. I mean, Biden's executive orders alone show that. So there was a shift from trying to help out people at the border to actually using that money to bring people to the border and then send them throughout the entirety of the U.S. And, these programs always use these nice language, and they just always tend to slip in a little extra something that tells you what they're really trying to do. And when we were looking around in FEMA, so for this program that we're talking about, the 30 million up to the 425 million currently, they note that that what it's for is to provide humanitarian relief to U.S. citizens. I went down too far. It's to provide governmental social service organizations to provide shelter, food, and supportive services to U.S. citizens who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing hunger and or homelessness. Sounds pretty good. But then they've tacked in this little follow-on statement. The program may also receive funding to provide humanitarian relief to families and individuals encountered by the Department of Homeland Security. And so what happened is the Biden regime basically either added that in or took that clause and then ran with it. And this is the same kind of thing we saw when we were looking through the State Department documents and the USAID documents. There's always a little extra clause that makes it sound like that's actually going to be just a tiny amount, but it gives them a little loophole. And then as we actually look at the numbers, we find out that all the money went there. It didn't actually go to its primary purpose.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that again takes me back to the original idea behind FEMA, which was it was called into life by President Carter about 45 years ago. The original idea was to help out states and local governments when they are overwhelmed by some emergency. So you then get this mission drift, and you really described aspects of this mission drift. But I think, and all organizations, all institutions undergo mission drift, and it's important sometimes to sort of pull back. But as long as it's just a drift, that might be possible. What I think has happened here with FEMA, and again, that's just being denied by the media as if they're just sort of saying it doesn't happen. And not only has it happened, you have more than just mission drift. You have a complete change in mission as far as FEMA is concerned. Now, the first kind of point that I was interested in this respect was, a couple of weeks ago with the first hurricane. And I was like, why are these guys always tweeting about misinformation and disinformation? Shouldn't these guys be involved with emergency response? That's why they exist. Isn't that their thing? And then I just went into their tweet history. And they have quite a long history, especially in recent years, of focusing on those kinds of topics. And then I was like, well, is this just happenstance? Is it just the guy who operates the Twitter account that this is just some DEI type? And then when you look at the strategic plan for FEMA, which was completely revamped during the Biden regime, and it was issued in 2022, you have it in there. It's spelled out in there. They say their number one goal of FEMA is to bring equity. So they're supposed to bring disaster relief. And instead, their number one goal, we're going to read it out here because I want to make sure I get it absolutely right. And we can put it up here as well. Their number one goal of FEMA, the Federal Disaster Emergency Agency, is to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. It's just completely unreal. And yet it's right there. It's right in front of our noses. So I would argue these guys have yes, they underwent some mission drift over the years, but then under Biden, the mission was just completely recalibrated. It just, the old mission is gone, and the new mission is equity, and hence they then get into all these concepts, that go with DEI, and one of them is disinformation, and hence they tweet so much about that. It's completely perverted what's happened here to an organization that should not be political, at all. This is emergency relief. Everyone agrees that that's a good thing. Yes, sometimes local governments get overwhelmed. You send in resources and so on when there's an emergency. But instead, everything's been turned on its head, like with so many other agencies. We've talked about this general problem so many times on this show, but it's FEMA as well. And, I guess I should have probably I should have expected this, and I should have looked more closely at FEMA much, much earlier. And I have to admit that was really triggered by the disastrous response to the first hurricane. But now it's all obvious what happened here. It's the same thing that happened with so many institutions.
Well, let me give an example of that, and also some clarity, because we've been talking about two separate programs. So I want to make sure everybody understands the magnitude of the numbers. There's the Shelter and Services Program, which spent $364 million on illegals in 2023, and $650 million in 2024. And then the program that we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes is the Emergency Food and Shelter Program. And that's where the $425 million was spent in addition to the $364 million. So these are combined numbers. And when you mentioned mission drift, we found a little footnote in their documents. And now we're talking about the Food and Services Program, the second one. And in 2023, FEMA appropriated $130 million to support local social service organizations aiding our nation's hungry and homeless. That's U.S. citizens. They provided the rest, $425 million, to help illegals. So just kind of let that sit in. $130 million for U.S. citizens, $425 million on top of the $364 million to help illegals. That's the kind of priorities that our government's federal agencies are placing on U.S. citizens versus illegals. And
Well, I would even
just
argue.
real quick, it's that concept that I think has really so grabbed people's attention with Hurricane Helene, is that suddenly numbers sort of get lost. $200 billion to Ukraine. So what's a billion? You don't even blink. But suddenly when you see this disparity of treatment and you see U.S. citizens not being taken care of, being treated as an afterthought, and then you see what's being given to illegals, I think that's why people are so rightly outraged right now, really having this issue put into their face in ways that sort of differ from numbers. They're seeing the inactivity, the inaction, the total lack of care from our government versus seemingly immense care and focus for people who aren't even citizens of this country.
But I completely agree, but we should be very careful not to even accept the premise of this food and shelter program.
No.
So that was kind of the first mission drift, because again, we are talking about the Federal Emergency Management Agency. That's what these guys do. If there's a hurricane, or one of the first things they did was the 3 Mile Island, the nuclear incident. So we're talking about things that
That's absolutely
just
right.
happened, disasters, unforeseen disasters, natural disasters, and so on. They overwhelm the authorities, the ones on the ground, the local ones, and then the federal government comes in and helps. When we're talking about giving shelter to homeless people or whatever, that's because of policy failures that this problem arose in the first place. These are very predictable things that happen on a long timeline, and it's just the failure of politicians, wherever this happens. Same for food, same for all these things. This has nothing to do, should have nothing to do with FEMA coming in, because it's no longer a matter of emergency. This is basically plugging holes created by poor policies and poor politicians and so on. So I just wanted to say that was the first kind of, we should not accept that premise at all, whether it's Americans or not. But of course, I completely agree with you that then once you don't accept, but once you kind of acknowledge, okay, that it exists, and then it expands even further, and suddenly it exists not just for Americans. It shouldn't exist for Americans, because, as I said, that this should be the job of governments to do their work properly, and if they don't, they should be replaced by governments that do. But let's assume, okay, that's fine, and they help out Americans, whatever. But then you've added this second element where the whole thing is morphed even further, where then helping a homeless American becomes helping some guy who crossed the border. But all of this has nothing to do with FEMA. But yet again, what I find so frustrating is that I don't think these discussions are taking place at all. I mean, people are arguing about whether FEMA should be spending this much or that much or whatever, but I don't think it's sort of sunk in yet that the entire reason for FEMA to exist has been totally perverted.
And that manifests itself in a couple different ways, and they're all emblematic of the way the government seems to work. It's like FEMA establishes this shelter and services program, and then they establish the that one was more recent, shelter and services, and then they have the emergency food and shelter program. And that's where they went, and that's already, as you say, a mission drift right there. Already different from what they're supposed to be doing. And then they go into that and they amplify that and create new uses for those programs that then become funding vehicles. And they always make it sound nice that, we're giving money to charities. What they don't tell you is that the charities are almost universally the NGOs. And, NGOs, non-governmental organization. And the way that everybody should think about those is that those are just off the books government arms. These things, it's not like they're distinct separate entities that are over in a corner and they just give some money to them. These are entities that work directly. These officials are almost interchangeable with government. They're interlaced with them. They move back and forth. They lobby the government for money. They're all friendly. So they're really more one and the same. And again, it's off the books government, and it's just the way to spend more money. The more I go through this, the more nuts I go about how wasteful our government is. There's another element to FEMA, and that's the COVID funding. And those numbers are astronomical. It appears that it may be like half of FEMA's budget for the COVID. What are they doing with COVID money in 2024? I mean, I don't know. I'm asking a rhetorical question. I don't know the answer to that. But what is FEMA doing in COVID? You maybe could have argued that on day one because everybody allowed it to be perceived as a disaster. How is that even a thing in 2024 for FEMA?
Well, in day one, in terms of setting up a field hospital or whatever.
Yeah.
And then a month after that, they're done. That's it. That's no longer FEMA. You're right. And of course, that builds huge dependencies where all these organizations basically exist off of the government. And as you say, the government or the people who are in those departments, they're happy because that's their political orientation. And you kind of build this whole almost parasitical system. It's like leeches that kind of just tag on, and then you're stuck with it. And it's permanent. Again, this whole FEMA thing is about non-permanence. We move in and help out local governments. This is if you look at the founding documents of this agency, we move in short term in an emergency and help out when, and the words used were when state and local governments are overwhelmed. But that must be temporary. You move in, you do whatever, and then you move out, and that's it. Then you might prepare for, you might restock or whatever and prepare for whatever might come next. But that's no longer the case. It's become a sort of a permanent thing. I mean, these programs you described, they're all permanent. And this, we haven't really discussed the even wider issue here, which, to be fair, is mainly driven by the State Department, but FEMA plays its role as well, which is what's driving this influx of migrants in the first place. And one of my absolute pet peeves, and this has been kind of this image is being created by the media for 10, 20 or so years, a long time, and it's completely embedded itself. And that's this image that some guy in Nicaragua or whatever wakes up one day and decides, I'm going to walk to the United States now, and then other people join him, whatever. And then I always have this picture of the Forrest Gump movie when Forrest Gump wakes up one day and decides he just wants to crisscross the United States, and then all these other people join him. And that's sort of the image that's been built here. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And in fact, that image kind of, you almost feel pity and you feel, you should help these people and so on and so forth. But it's not that at all. I mean, no one does that. What actually happens is that these migrant movements are actually funded by U.S. taxpayers in the first place. And I think that point is so widely, misunderstood or not appreciated.
You just triggered something because in the first article that we did on this, where we were focusing on the State Department and the USAID, we actually took a look at that, and that was absolutely infuriating because you're right. That sort of generic picture that people have in their heads that this is organic is absolutely false. And this is coming from a State Department report. In Central America and Mexico, PRM, that's a division of the State Department, support helps government officials and civil society, I'm quoting, to identify, screen, protect, and assist vulnerable migrants and to strengthen national asylum systems and other protection capacities. What they're doing is they've quite literally built up, our State Department has quite literally paid to build up the infrastructure down in Central America to identify people who could be likely candidates to come up. And then we have the way stations, which are built all along the way. So this whole idea of even just these pictures of these caravans with people coming up kind of in an organic manner, that is not what's happening. Those people are being directed, they're being paid for, they're being given cash debit cards along the way, they're being given food, water, shelter, they're being given transportation. Nobody is walking the entire distance from here to here. At various stages, they're getting bussed all the way up. And once they get here, they're transferred over into facilities right across the border. And then they're flown to wherever. Sometimes I think they have some discretion where they want to go, but very often they're directed to states. And a lot of times they're directed to places that happen to be very red and change them dynamically. There's another element that we haven't even talked about yet that I think is going to become a larger story going forward, and that is all the fraud that's going to come out over this program. And the same thing with COVID, where we have these enormous amounts of what's effectively discretionary spending with little or no oversight. And I think we're going to see it at the city level. I think when you go and you look at some of these cities that have had this, 1/3 of their population is suddenly, it's swelled by 33% or whatever with new immigrants. And, it's starting to look like that there's kind of pre-planning that went in place in this. And I'm 100% positive from what I already know that we are going to uncover massive, massive fraud that's taking place probably with officials within these various municipalities.
You made this point a few shows ago that your kind of number one remedy for all these problems, like literally every problem, is to drastically size down the federal government. Just cut, cut, cut. And you couldn't have been more right. And here's an application of it, just what you said right now. State Department, 90% cut, just 90% of people gone, 90% of the money gone. Well, then the 10% that are left have to deal with what the State Department is actually meant to do, which is to be the interface between the United States and other countries, diplomacy, not these kinds of let's go to El Salvador and fly some people over because, we like to do that. By the way, I mentioned El Salvador, but I fell off my chair there when I saw that this is happening right now with El Salvador, which is meant to be the oasis of Latin America. With Bukele in charge and so on. And it is. I mean, I haven't been, but from everything I've read and seen, there's been a huge turnaround there. So why on earth is the State Department basically flying people over on refugee status? It just makes no sense. So anyway, all these busybodies.
Who's a refugee in El Salvador right now?
Exactly. Who?
The gangs.
They have freedom of speech. They have freedom.
The gangs are the refugees.
Yeah. Right. So if you coming back to this point of cutting, if you cut 90% of their budget and of their staff, well, then there's going to be no more busybodies left who sit around all day thinking about all these schemes of how they can, pretend to be important. And then that's not going to happen anymore. And same with FEMA. I mean, people say, oh, you can't cut FEMA's staff. Well, I just cut 90% of it. But then I would say, yeah, you can hire people whenever there's emergencies. You can hire temporary. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be there for emergencies. Again, I think cutting everything is the solution. Once you do that, everything else falls into place.
Yep, slash and burn. One of the things that I discovered that I guess I should have known but didn't fully appreciate was how powerful our State Department is. In our travels, you and I have often been focused on the DOJ because so many things emanated from there, and the FBI is a unit of the DOJ, et cetera. But the State Department is the one that's controlling everything. They're controlling what USA does. They're controlling what the NGOs do. They're controlling what FEMA does. It's all flowing downhill out of the State Department. And the State Department is the one that engages in regime changes overseas. It just really started driving home how many tentacles the State Department actually has. It's kind of one of those things that I always knew, but because I was more focused on the DOJ, I hadn't given the full mental credit for it. And we're really seeing that come forth as we've been looking into this. And again, that is the answer. The answer is massive downsizing. And the big question is there the political will or ability to do that? Getting somebody like Elon and Vivek, those guys to come in and maybe try and address some of that under Trump, that's fantastic. But our GOP has been so feckless and so useless. I worry about the ability to do what is probably the only single solution we have: massive downsizing.
It has to be done. Now, ironically, Department of Justice, DOJ, is not even the worst one in terms of kind of controlling it or reining it back in, because its size and all its tentacles aren't as wide as these others. Now, that doesn't mean they're not corrupt and haven't done horrible things and so on. But I'm just saying is they should be one of the easier ones to rein in. As you say, State Department is terrible. I mean, let's say Mike Pompeo was a good guy and had the right idea. Let's say anyone, okay, forget about Pompeo, just anyone, person X, and you put them there. How on earth is one person going to have an overview of all these different tentacles that have kind of grown over the years? You got this section doing that, and that, they're doing their thing. And it's almost impossible to get a grasp of all these things. So, Elon is perhaps one of the few human beings alive whose kind of brain power is able to compute all that and to at least make a start in that. The other one is DHS, Homeland Security. It's just crazy how many agencies and tentacles that place has. Remember CISA? I mean, CISA was opened up under DHS, under Trump's watch, supposedly to look after cybersecurity infrastructure. Okay, someone said that, and everyone said, "Oh, that's a good idea." And what did they end up doing? They ended up becoming the censorship agency of the United States. Well, one of the censorship agencies of the United States government. So, again, who keeps an eye on all these things when there's so many going on, all across the board? It's almost impossible. You first of all, you need a team. Completely agree. It's great that Trump now has a team. Unlike 2016, unlike 2020, to be fair as well. And he doesn't seem to mind having a team. I'm not sure whether it was by intent or not that he did not previously. I mean, you know how he just kept replacing and he's good and just exchanging, but there wasn't like a core team. The core was him. That's it. And now there seems to be a core team. So this is very, very important. And then, of course, the people on that team need to be extremely skilled, like hugely high IQ people. And he has that too. So I'm not saying it's easy, and I completely agree. The Republicans will be an impediment to all this, and the DC establishment will just cause a huge stink, and it will all be extremely difficult. But at least for the first time, I see like some little bit of hope of trying to crack down on all this.
And RFK as well. I didn't mean to leave him out of this because he's going to be an integral part as well. And again, I also think your earlier point is valid in that, the DOJ, as polluted as it is, and it is completely corrupted, totally polluted, but the ability for somebody to come in as an attorney general and walk through the different divisions of the DOJ is a lot easier, although the FBI is problematic because it's its own thing, even though it's technically under the DOJ. It's a lot easier to do than the State Department because, as you said, like that, the State Department is sort of the epitome of the deep state. Like if there's an area where the deep state resides, it's got to be the State Department because there's just this blending of the intelligence community and the State Department officials in so many areas. That's where the CIA operates. And, there's so many just completely autonomous divisions that it probably is almost impossible to get your hands around coming in as a four-year official, as the Secretary of State. You're just addressing kind of the current hot zones, and you have no idea what's really going on at all these places. So yeah, it is going to be more difficult. I'm with you. I very much love the idea that Elon coming in. I've appreciated, you've probably seen it as well, but watching podcasts with Elon. And he'll get asked a question, and it most hits me if I happen to be listening to it on headphones while I'm doing something. And there'll be this long period of silence, and I'll think, did I just lose, did it shut off or something? And I'll poke my head around and look, and you'll see Elon's just either looking in the distance or has his eyes closed. And you see the processing going on, and then he answers the question in depth. And he's been thinking about it the entire time on an entirely different level. So you do raise a very good point that having somebody like that, it brings in a whole nother element that we've never, ever had before.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. It's like you can see the supercomputer is churning over, and it always spits out the right answer, or at least a very, very thoughtful answer. So he'd rather spend a bit of time thinking about it than just kind of blurt out some platitude, which is, this is really great.
I've never seen anybody so willing to just, in the middle of something, just stop and not give any thought. He doesn't care. I'm thinking about the question that you asked me, and you can see the brain power churning before he then responds. And he doesn't care if he waits 10, 20 seconds, whatever. He's thinking about a proper answer as opposed to feeling compelled to speak. Never seen that before.
No, no, same here. Having him on board, hugely fantastic. Yeah, RFK, of course, especially if you um, assign him to his sort of pet topics. This is very important. You don't, someone like Elon, you can assign him to all the topics because you know he'll think about it in that kind of way. But others, you want to assign them to the things that they're good at. JD Vance as well. I mean, he is an extremely impressive guy, just in terms of how he can articulate things and how he can just think on the spot and just come up with the right answers. And by right answers, I don't necessarily mean I have to agree with or what a policy, or whatever. What I mean is thoughtful, thought through. This is so, so important. Let's not forget DeSantis. I mean, he is also, and he's not part of that core Trump group, but who knows what might come in a year from now or even less than that. Just imagine him as Attorney General. I don't think he would play games. I don't think he would do the kind of bar stuff or sessions. I mean, it's completely useless. I think he would go in there and try and clean up. But I still think, I mean, we can name a lot of other names here, Vivek and whoever. But I still think the most important thing, and I know you're the one who actually raised it like here a few weeks ago, is just cut the staff, cut the money. And sometimes you don't even have to overthink these problems. You don't even have to plan it into the last detail of what are you going to keep, what are you going to cut, what. Sometimes you just have to cut. Just cut the money and then everything will fall into place by itself. Yeah, you have to plan a bit ahead, but I would just say don't overthink it. Don't spend too many years figuring out how you're going to reorganize this or that. Just start taking away the money.
There's so
And
much
then,
fat that you can literally just come in and start slashing,
yeah,
theoretically,
yeah.
right? You don't even have to worry about, what am I doing in terms of reducing effectiveness? Because basically the whole point is to reduce effectiveness because the effectiveness is misdirected and completely wasted. So just come in with a blowtorch. Honestly, I think that's maybe going to be the primary measure of the success of the Trump administration if Trump wins, is what is he able to do in terms of downsizing the government? Secondarily would probably be mass deportations, which I am fully on board with, but I think even the larger impact is going to be, can he actually downsize the federal government materially? Because it just has to be done.
Jeff, I would argue that if you downsize the government, and I mean drastically, hugely, I mean, I mentioned 90%, that would be ideal, but realistically, let's say 50%, but massive. It has to be absolutely massive. And money means people. You got to get rid of the people. They just can't, you can't have all these people working in government. It's just no good. I would argue that if you did that, these other problems, including migrants and so on and so forth, would start going away by themselves. I mean, not you might have to do something, but it would kickstart that whole process because as we started off here today, the reason why so many people are here is the government. It's that the government is not only sponsoring this but encouraging this, paying for this. So if there was nothing else that was done, if it was just the slashing of the budgets, I would be quite happy with that because I'd be very confident that not all problems are going to be solved that way, but a lot of other problems are going to be solved that way.
There's one other element here as well, and it's something that I've been trying to make the case for over the last few weeks, and that is that I believe that the single largest source of wealth for the United States in terms of quickly realizable value is in downsizing the government. That the wealth, the amount of waste, inefficiency, etc., is so vast that if you attack that, you literally free up trillions of dollars of immediate wealth to Americans, whether it's in the form of lower taxes, just lower payroll. It goes through everything. Like I can't point to one thing. Everybody's taxes would drop. It's just an immediate source of national wealth, getting rid of some of this waste. So,
well, on the kind of the wide angle view, of course, I completely agree. But I mean, we could even kind of try and sum it up here in a few sentences. The government does not produce anything of value.
nope.
The government only spends. So it's private industry, it's individuals who produce value. Now, the government gobbles up, what is it? 40, 50%, something like that. A huge chunk of that value that's created in the private sector. The government does not create that. It's done by the private sector. Now, if just just an abstract concept, if something swallows up 50% of the money you make, and it no longer does that, it only swallows up 20% or 10% or whatever, all that other money is left to invest and do all kinds of wonderful things with. So we don't even have to get into all the specifics and all the details. Just on a completely abstract level, I completely agree with you. It would be the biggest boon to the economy, to the country, to everything, just to downsize the government and to do and absolutely hugely drastically.
Yeah, and just the final thing, I guess, is it's a lot more than 40%. Technically, it should be 40%, but when you look at what's happened with our national debt and the absolute explosion under that, it's more like, when you add in the numbers back, it's more than 100% of what we're producing, because not only is the government spending, but the government is taking on all sorts of extra debt to do the additional spending, and it's equating to more than what we're actually producing. So, you do the math, you do the back of the envelope math, and it's just astonishing how much wealth can be put back into the system.